All right, Chapter 31 American Life in the Roaring Twenties, 1919 to 1929. This is a bit of a catch all chapter, although it's one of the more interesting catch all chapters. Talks a little bit about social causes, little tiny bit about politics, but a lot about technology, the arts, but in a good way, and really the rise of the consumer culture in America and how that deals with the aftermath of uh, the Industrial Revolution, I guess. We're several generations deep into that now. And lastly, you get a little taste of the boom and bust economy that's going on. So we're going to start with some Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks are the Russians. There's the Russian Revolution in 1917, right, where the commies take over. America gets scared that we might be next, and it's really part of it is because we had so many socialist groups that were small, but they were running around and they were very boisterous, right? You got the Wobblies, the International Workers of the World. You got our favorite socialist, Eugene V. Debs. You got our favorite muckraker, Upton Sinclair, who's writing the Jungle, and he's a commie and all this other stuff, right? Well, Karl Marx, who writes the Communist Manifesto, he envisioned a communist revolution to occur in a highly industrialized country like Germany, Britain, or America. And since this appears to be taking place now in the world in 1917, and it's taking place in Russia, which is a fairly rural place, the capitalists in America kind of freak out. And so that leads us to a Red Scare, 1919 to 1920, which turns into a nationwide crusade against left-wingers. You're going to see we're going to have another Red Scare in the aftermath of World War II in the early 1950s, and this is our first one. So they always seem to pop up after world wars. Uh, and the main proponent, I guess, or advancer of this Red Scare is the Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer. He ends up attacking, arresting, rounding up over 6,000 suspects, guys who were alleged to have embedded themselves into the American government, into the press, and most importantly, into business. So he really had a tendency to target people who were union organizers or leaders. Think Eugene Debs. Well, lo and behold, these are called the Palmer raids. And lo and behold, what happens? But a bomb explodes at Palmer's home, and it just kind of makes him extremely scared, very frightened. But it heightens the tension and the fear of Americans that these evil Bolsheviks are embedded in our country, willing to engage in terrorist activities at a moment's notice. So you can see here the Wobblies, they're prosecuted. This pretty much kills the Wobblies. Very, very similar how the Haymarket riot kills the Knights of Labor. The bomb and the Palmer raids kill the IWW. Conservative businesses, they love this. So if you're a factory owner and there's a Red Scare and your workers are complaining that they're not getting paid enough or they're working too hard or that it's dangerous and they start to form a union, what are you going to accuse them of? You're going to accuse them of being a Bolshevik, right? And it's a way that big business can utilize the hysteria to weaken their opponents. And in this case, their opponents are their own working class. Bam! Right there's a bomb blows up on Wall Street in 1920. No one's ever caught, and no one knows who did it. But this is that time period of the Red Scare, and everybody felt like it must have been a commie, because who else would blow up the most sacred spot in all of capitalist world, that of Wall Street? Moving from Bolsheviks to the KKK. I have no transition there. The Ku Klux Klan. They are reinvigorated in the 1920s, but it's not your grandpa's KKK. This one looks different, and they're not riding around just on horseback with the hoods over their heads. In fact, your mom, right? Your mom could be in the KKK, and she's not covering her face, and they're marching right down the street, and they become almost really a political organization as opposed to a terrorist organization. And it's in part because of Birth of a Nation, the famous movie by D.W. Griffith, which we'll talk about later on in this lecture. Um, but it's because they kind of morph. They mature into a nativist movement. So that it's not just solely anti-black. It's not solely anti-carpetbagger, which those are the northern whites, remember. It turns into anti-foreign, anti-Jewish, and anti-Catholic as well. So it looks a lot like the Know Nothing Party of the 1850s. Right? They're just against this new wave of immigration that's happening. And so the famous quote from your book is "Kill the kikes, coons, and Catholics." Notice all the K's. Okay. Speaking of immigrants, we get the Immigration Act of 1924, which is actually an expansion of another Immigration Act of 1921. And so you have all these nativists, including the Klan, right, that are against all of these new wave immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. And during World War One, immigration really goes down because everybody's too busy fighting, and boat traffic in the Atlantic isn't the safest thing. In the aftermath of World War One, immigration really pops up again, and because America emerges from World War One as really the economic superpower of the world, there's a flood of immigration, and so the nativists they're able to change public opinion so much that the federal government really, for the first time, stops immigration, and they don't stop it outright, but they pass these laws. The first law is actually the law that political cartoon depicts. Is they set a quota on the number of foreigners at 3% actually of the people of their nationality living in the U.S. in 1910. So if there were, we will say, 100 Polish people in 1910 living in the United States, then only 3 would be allowed to migrate. 3 additional Polish people would be allowed to migrate. They didn't like this though. They fixed it, and they fixed it because of the date of the census. In 1910, you already had a huge number of these Southern and Eastern Europeans that had migrated, and they weren't considered to be as good, right, as the Blue Bloods, the Germanic English ancestors, the Scotch Irish, right? And so they changed the quota to the census of 1890, and they lowered it from 3% to 2%. Because you didn't have this new wave immigration start until about 1890 or so, this really decreases the amount of unsavory immigrants from places like Italy, and Poland, and Greece, and Russia, Croatia. It's for you, Rajik. Immigration. Here you go. You get to see how this works, right? 1907 to 1914, you're getting massive numbers of immigrants, and they're coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. Then you have that first Quota Act, which makes it almost equal of the old world immigrants from Northern and Western Europe and the new wave. They didn't like that. That wasn't racist enough, so we got to ratchet up the racism a little bit. And so you get the Quota Act of 1924, right? And then there's several others that just keep whittling this down and down and down. Switching from immigrants to prohibition. And really, there is a transition here because a lot of these immigrants moved to cities, and alcohol is part of their culture, and the nativists were against this. And so, how do you attack this? Well, the teetotalers we're talking about for several chapters here, even the populists, even the abolitionists really had some of this prohibition elements aspect to them. It finally comes to fruition in the 18th Amendment. It happens in 1919. And under the Necessary and Proper Clause, Congress then passes the Volstead Act to actually set the penalties and enforcement criteria of the 18th Amendment. It was very popular in the South for good old-fashioned racist purposes, and that was to keep alcohol away from African Americans and those darn Catholics. It was not popular in the cities, and this is when you really see the rise of the street gangs in order to control the black market sale and transportation of the booze. The most famous story really is in good old Chi-Town in Chicago in the 1920s, where over 500 mobsters were murdered in that decade. This is a picture of your book of the cops who have captured a still and a bunch of jars of moonshine. I'm not going to go into great detail here, but essentially you put the ingredients in here and you boil it, and then the condensation goes up here, and then it condenses, and what's left is alcohol. And the more and more you do that, the purer the alcohol. There you go. So who are the guys, right? The main guys in Chicago that were the gangsters. You got Alphonse Capone, otherwise known as Scarface here, and he was in charge of the Southern Italian gang in Chicago, on the south side of Chicago. And then this guy is a guy by the name of Bugs Moran, and he was in charge of the Irish gang, which was predominantly on the north side of Chicago. So throughout the 1920s, these two gangs fought. Capone's gang wins, and one of the major victories is the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, which is photographed right here. Capone wanted to kill Bugs Moran, and so, long story short, he got some guys who claimed that they were other people, who called Moran and said they had some cheap whiskey to sell, and so they set up a place to sell this whiskey in a storehouse or a warehouse on Lincoln Avenue on the near north side. And so they showed up and they're selling the whiskey to Bugs Moran's guys. Meanwhile, some other Capone guys who were dressed up like cops pull up in a couple squad cars, and they act like they're raiding it, arresting everybody. Right around this time period, Bugs Moran actually pulls up. He sees the cop cars. He was a little bit late to the meeting, and so he thinks that it's getting raided, so he just keeps driving by. And a decision actually saves his life, because of course, what do these cops do? Is they seize the weapons and line up Bugs Moran guys against the wall, and then mow them down with a bunch of machine guns. The good old-fashioned Tommy gun. Moving from gangs to evolution. You get the Scopes monkey trial. A high school biology teacher, a guy by the name of John T. Scopes, he gets busted in 1925 for teaching evolution in high school in Tennessee. Remember, this was big no-no. This is deep within the Bible Belt, where the world was created in 7 days and all that good stuff. This turns into the trial of the century. It's huge. In this tiny little town, I think it's Dayton in Tennessee, is flooded with all the press of the entire country that want to see this battle take place. And it's a huge battle because you get superstar attorneys on either side. Scopes is represented by, kind of the Johnny Cochran of the day, a guy by the name of Clarence Darrow. The prosecution actually gets a special prosecutor, a name very familiar to us, the old lion himself, William Jennings Bryan, Mr. Populist. He'd been the Secretary of State, he'd been in Congress a bunch of times, he ran for president about, 30 times, and now he's the prosecutor of the case. Evidently he was a big Bible guy. William Jennings Bryan actually takes the weird step during the trial of taking the stand himself. This is something that lawyers almost never do, and they never would, because he takes the stand as an expert witness in the Bible. What an odd thing. And of course, Clarence Darrow then on cross-examination makes him look absolutely stupid. So much so that Bryan dies of a stroke 5 days after the trial. So we're done talking about William Jennings Bryan finally. So in the way the Scopes monkey trial is portrayed is a victory for evolution, right? Bryan even dies as a result of this. However, if you paid attention to the case, Scopes actually is found guilty. And so he actually loses the case. William Jennings Bryan actually wins, but that's just not how it's covered in history. And there's a picture from your book showing all the people that showed up there. This was big. This was the OJ Simpson case, Trayvon Martin case of the day back then in the 1920s. In hindsight, it seems like such a trivial reason to have a huge case, doesn't it? All right, switching to a fairly cool part of this chapter. That's the mass consumption economy. The life of an American prior to this was very different than afterwards. And starting in the 1920s, life in America looks a lot like it does today. We become a nation of haves. We're a couple generations deep into the Industrial Revolution. People are getting into unions, or if they're not into unions, businesses they're rising their wages and they're giving more time off. So you start to see the middle class grow, and they're a people with disposable income, where they're not simply living hand to mouth. And this is a time period of good times economy wise also. And a lot there's all kind of circles around because of the automobile. It has here by 1930 there are almost 30 million cars in the United States. This in and of itself employs 6 million people. Right? 30 years before this, almost nobody had an automobile, and that meant that almost nobody was employed making these automobiles. In addition to that, this huge growth of the automobile causes all these other ancillary industries to pop up, which in turn creates hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of jobs. And the types of industries we're talking about are rubber for tires, glass for all the windshields and side windows, fabrics for all of the stuff, the seats and stuff like that, the highway construction, gas stations, mechanics. Think about how many things are related to a car and stuff that you need to build a car and to keep a car running. And that's a massive amount. Obviously, this is going to cause the oil industry and the refineries to explode in importance and popularity. And all of this just keeps creating more and more and more jobs. Another aspect of this is buying on credit. So you're probably not, when you buy your first car, you're probably not going to pay cash for it. You're going to have to get some sort of a loan, and so you're going to have to make car payments. This really becomes popular during this time period, and unfortunately, the American public kind of goes nuts. It's okay if you do this for like a house and a car, but if you start buying stuff on credit, other stuff, then you just dig yourself deeper and deeper into debt. And Americans start to do that in the 1920s. It's because they're buying on credit such newfangled technology as cars, refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, radios. Speaking of radios, here's a family in the 1920s gathered around with their Beats headphones, listening to the radio, and apparently the dad is worried about flooding because he's got those pants well prepared. Okay, here's a chart from your book, The Cost of a Model T in Months of Labor for the Average National Wage. This is what I mean by this. In 1908, that's when the Model T was introduced. Your average worker would have to save up 20 months worth of his salary to pay for a Model T. That's a lot, right? It's prohibitively expensive for most workers. Because of Taylorism, the assembly line, mass production, all the stuff, the innovations that Henry Ford makes, the cost of that Model T keeps dropping and dropping and dropping until by 1924 we're talking like 2 to 3 months worth of salary, which is affordable for virtually anybody in America, and that's why you see that explosion all the way to 30 million cars. Here you can see the rise of the number of cars worldwide and how the rest of the world, really even to this day, even though this chart only goes to 1970, isn't even in the same league as the United States. You can see for most of the rest of the world, for most of the history of the automobile, you could add up all of the other countries combined, and it doesn't even equal the United States. I think it does nowadays, because a lot of people in China drive cars now, as in other areas of Asia. All right, switching from automobiles to planes. You've heard the stories about Orville and Wilbur Wright. Well, December 17th, 1903, Orville flies the very first plane in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. It was a grand total of like 100 yards in 12 seconds or something like that. And, the two brothers keep tinkering with this plane over the next several years. One of them dies in a plane crash. I think it was Wilbur. And they get bigger engines. They tweak the wing design, the fuselage, stuff like that. And then obviously World War One has a lot of developments in aviation. And then it culminates in the other thing that you see a lot, not a lot on tests, but is talked about a lot in books, is the transatlantic flight by Charles Lindbergh from New York to Paris in 1927. Okay, switching now to Hollywood. This is such a weird slide, too. When you think of Hollywood today, it is uber liberal, right? It is very pro-feminist. It's very embracing of races, far more so than the rest of society, right? Far earlier did it embrace other ethnicities and races before the rest of society. Far more embracing of homosexuals, we'll say, before the rest of society. Right? It's kind of a forerunner in liberal culture, I would say. Obviously, that's not the case, though. Look at this. D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, 1915. It's kind of like the grandfather of all full-length movies. It's the first movie that has a really long plot that slowly develops over time, where you have a protagonist and an antagonist, right? The climax and the denouement, all that other stuff that you guys read about in high school. Well, the first movie to do this is Birth of a Nation. And we talked about it before in that it reinvigorates the Klan. And, Woodrow Wilson, of course, loves it. He has the famous quote. He's like, oh, it's only so sad that it's true, or something like that. Uh, this is one of the most racist pieces of filth you'll ever hear about, let alone see. And yet, it's one of the most important pieces of cinematic history of all time. Other types of movies that were very, very popular during the 19 teens and 1920s were, let, let's be honest, they were pornos. They were filled with nudity. And, they had all these, apparently vampires even back then were popular. You would have these very seductive, topless vampires that were called vamps. So that term is still around today. Your book even kind of talks about it a little bit. Then you have the big development, right? Because these are all silent films where you just see the words at the bottom of the screen, and then perhaps it's set to music, but you don't actually hear the characters talk themselves. Well, this changes with the first quote-unquote talkie, which is known as the jazz singer. There's a picture of the jazz singer there down at the bottom of the screen. What do you notice about it? It's a white guy, Al Jolson, in blackface. This movie is essentially a minstrel show. So you have this extremely embracing liberal entity in 2014 that starts out as an extremely kind of racist, naughty organization in its infancy, which is it's come a long way, I guess. Here's one of the other things that how it impacts Americans. Prior to Hollywood, prior to these films, you would have different regional tastes, right? Where everybody in a certain region would dress the same, talk the same, have the same interests in fashion, food, and whatnot. When you start to have these movies, which are played nationwide, this public, as they become fans of these movies, they adopt the tastes of these movies, and so movies themselves leads to the standardization of tastes and language. And you can see even the rest of the world, right? They kind of are copycats of all things American music, American fashion, American sports. And why is that? It's really because of Hollywood and how most of the entertainment industry for the whole world really is fixated and focused on America. The dynamic decade. All right, this lady here, Margaret Sanger. You don't have any. This isn't a part of some weird early Hollywood movie here. What you're seeing is Margaret Sanger was a feminist. One of the most important feminists of all time, one of the earliest feminists of modern America, and her cause was birth control. She was against the idea that women were essentially slaves to their bodies, and that their husbands or boyfriends would impregnate them, and then they're stuck, right? They're stuck being a mom for the rest of their life. And that often meant that you couldn't work in the workplace and you were kind of economically and legally bound to some other guy. And so she advocated the use of birth control. The problem for her is this was illegal virtually everywhere in the United States. And so, as a very sarcastic way of advancing her cause, she would get in front of a crowd and she would have this thing bound over her lips so that she couldn't speak, and then she would stand in front of a chalkboard and basically write out her arguments as a sarcastic end around of the local laws that were that made it criminalized the advocacy of birth control. Okay, in addition to using birth control, women started cutting their hair short and wear dresses that showed some leg and apparently dance like They're having a seizure. Uh, my God, look at those men. This this is what happens when white people dance. This is awful. So I don't know what this guy. I mean, this could be your dad, right, or your grandpa, at a wedding, and you can see just how embarrassing and awful. This guy's obviously in mid dump. Um, okay, and to fashion also for women, they start to wear bathing suits that were a little too risque, right? This lady's showing some leg. On second thought, maybe she should be showing a little less leg. In addition to a fairly unflattering look, you get the creepy beach police who's gonna stick a ruler up your skirt, evidently, to make sure that it's just long enough. Uh, and they were not the Kate Uptons of their day. Okay, switching to something more tangible. Marcus Garvey. So we've talked a lot about African American leaders from the 1800s. The biggest ones were Frederick Douglass, that's kind of the pre-slavery leader, and then to Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, right? Eventually, we're going to get to the Civil Rights Movement, and that's really led by Thurgood Marshall, Malcolm X, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. There's a big break in between there, though, right? There's several decades. And really, that break is bridged by this guy right here, Marcus Garvey. And he founds the United Negro Improvement Association, otherwise known as the UNIA. He's very similar in his beliefs to Booker T. Washington, and he wanted really like a separate economic sphere for African Americans. And so he promoted the creation of black corporations, and they would issue stock, and then that stock would be marketed to black people. And so these would be black-owned businesses, and they would cater to blacks. The most famous one was the Black Star Line steamship, which is going to be a cruise ship for black people, basically. Doesn't really work out. It kind of coincides with the collapse of the economics of the age. Marcus Garvey apparently was guilty of mail fraud, and so he was convicted and deported back to Jamaica, where he was born in 1927. What you see, though, is this is really the bridge between Booker T. Washington's economic independence argument and Malcolm X's black nationalist movement. And thrown into this is you still had this traditional viewpoint of not just white people, but also within the African American community of resettling blacks back to Africa. Now, I don't think that would be a very popular cause to champion nowadays, but you can see throughout a huge portion of American history, that was a cause that was advocated white and black alike. All right, then your book goes into what's called cultural liberation, where it talks a lot about the literary and artistic developments of the time period. I'm not going to go into great detail. The two big things I want to talk about, though, are modernism, which was a movement that really was a reactionary movement to the troubles of urbanization and industrialization. The type of art and stories that you see that comprise this modernism, they really challenge social norms, social conventions, traditional authorities. And what I mean by that is you had this Victorian England of this aristocracy and old money and propriety and very rigid roles for men and women, rich and poor. And these books and the art really challenges this. And so the two most famous authors at the time are F. Scott Fitzgerald, which writes almost directly about this in The Great Gatsby, and Ernest Hemingway, who writes about this in The Sun Also Rises, Farewell to Arms. Meanwhile, remember we talked about the Great Migration a couple chapters ago, where you have all these African Americans moving from the south as sharecroppers to the north, where they start to work in factories. Hundreds of thousands of them moved to New York, into the Harlem neighborhood. And what you get is the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s. And these are African Americans who, through political and more so even art and musical standpoints, they start advocating what they call, quote unquote, a new Negro, who is a full citizen and is a social equal to whites. Now, this is different than Marcus Garvey's black separatist movement. This sounds an awful lot like W.E.B. Du Bois' uh, strategies with the NAACP, and also later on in the decades to come, what Martin Luther King advocates in the South. All right, we finally get to the economy. Now, what you have here is a change in the taxes, and you have different world events that transpire also involving this, and this results in boom times for Americans and a lot of cash in their pocket. And what they do with this cash seems like a great idea in the short term and ends up blowing up in their face. And here's what I mean by that. Taxes were relatively high, right? Almost all sectors of society were taxed. We even had the new income tax, right, that had been passed about a decade prior to this. Meanwhile, you get a bunch of Republican presidents. The first one, Warren G. Harding. Then you get Calvin Coolidge. Then you get Herbert Hoover, right? And so the Secretary of the Treasury is a guy by the name of Andrew Mellon. And it was his argument that the rich people don't want to pay taxes, right? They're no different than the rest of us. And so a rich person, though, is going to stash his extra income into tax-exempt securities. So put it in places where he doesn't have to pay taxes. What this does, though, is that money really can't be used. So if you could help out the rich and let them use their money in a way where they wouldn't have to pay such high taxes, but that it would benefit the rest of society, this would be great. And so if you lower their taxes, then rich people are going to invest in things like factories. And factories are going to help the economy because they're going to build stuff and they're going to employ people. So the idea is if you lower taxes, you're actually going to decrease unemployment. So he engineers a series of tax reductions. Has something to the effect where, you know, like 40% reductions in taxes for lots of different areas. Congress also repeals a bunch of other taxes involving excise taxes and sales taxes, estate taxes, stuff like that. And what this does is it favors the rapid expansion of capital investment. In other words, rich people and even not rich people, middle class people, have a ton of extra money in their pocket that otherwise they would have had to pay to the government. So what are they going to do with it? Right? They're going to try and make more money with it. The two ways that they do this is real estate speculation and the stock market. Now, we've talked about real estate speculation a lot so far in this course. That's where you think that you're going to make money off of land by buying land, perhaps building houses, condominiums, apartments on it, and then selling it, right? And so that's what's happening in the 1920s, especially in Florida. The problem with Florida is that it's very swampy, and people aren't doing due diligence, and so they're basically paying a lot of money for swampland that can never and will never be built upon. And it makes the price of this real estate go up, and up. It creates what's called a bubble. Another way that you would invest money is in the stock market, right? We have all of these corporations. It seems like every single one of them is doing great. So the idea is to buy the stock low and sell it high. You can buy lots of stock if you buy it on margin, and that's basically a loan from the bank. You have to pay a down payment, usually it's 10%, and the bank will give you the other 90%, and then you use that 100% to buy the stock, right? As long as the stock price goes up, you're going to make bank despite the fact that you've only gave an initial very, very small investment, right? It's like making a $10 bet, but having the same effect of making a $100 bet. Make sense? Now, the problem with a margin is that there can be a margin call. The bank at any time can give you 24 hours to demand its remaining 90% money. What this usually means is that you're forced to sell the stock that you originally used the loan to pay for. Now, if the stock price has gone up, that's not an issue at all, right? You just pay the difference and you still made a healthy profit. But if the stock price has gone down, you have to sell the stock and you're not going to have enough money to cover the loan that you still owe the bank. And if you've done this in the thousands of dollars, this can absolutely devastate you. You can see where I'm leading with this. This is what happens in October 1929. And there's the last slide. So we got 1903, the Wright Brothers, 1908, the Model T, the Bolshevik Revolution, 1919, 18th Amendment, Volstead Act, 1919. You get the Red Scare there in the early 1920s. Radio broadcasting begins in 1920. You get some other laws that I didn't talk about in the 1920s. You get the Scopes trial in 1925, the Florida real estate boom 1925. Then you get the Lindbergh flight in 27, and Capone's imprisoned in 1932. And that's it.